Okay. This afternoon's panel is on Biden, COVID, and the left. I'm going to read the panel description, and then I'll introduce the speakers from left to right in the order that they'll be speaking. At its birth, the Millennial Left aspired to pose a political challenge to neoliberalism. In 2020, the Millennial Left wanted to fight the right to elect the lesser evil to office, and has apparently succeeded, collapsing back into the neoliberal antinomy of progressive statism and personal responsibility as a result. How could the COVID crisis have presented an opportunity for the left to break with the politics of the Democratic Party? What do the responses by the state and civil society to the pandemic reflect? Not about neoliberalism, but about capitalism per se. How should the left think about post-pandemic politics, even as the aim of building a mass movement and party remains ever more distant? So immediately to my left, which will appear to you to be the left side of the table, we have Conrad Hamilton, who has a PhD from Paris 8 University and is currently teaching at Pôle Universitaire Léonard de Vinci, sorry for my pronunciation. His thesis, supervised by Catherine Malabou, dealt with the role of real abstraction within the Marxist tradition. He has published in Jacobin, Ario, the Philosophical Salon, 3 Ampersands, and Marion West. He is also co-author of Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson, published by Zero Books. Next is Anthony Monteiro, who has a long history as an activist in the left, starting with the civil rights movement and the Black freedom movement, and helped elect several Black candidates. Monteiro is a scholar of W.E.B. Du Bois and the founder of the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation in Philadelphia. Benjamin Balthaser is an associate professor of multi-ethnic U.S. literature at Indiana University, South Bend. He is the author of Anti-Imperialist Modernism and Dedication. He is currently working on a political and literary history of the U.S. Jewish left and anti-Zionism on contract with Verso Books. He is a member of the Chicago Democratic Socialists of America. And finally, Cam Hardy is a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society since 2008. He currently works as a butcher at a meatpacking plant. He lives in Toronto, Canada, with his wife and his daughter. So the way that this panel is going to work is that we're going to give about 12 minutes for each of the panelists to give their opening remarks. It will be followed by a round of responses where they get to respond to each other, and then we will open up for an audience Q&A. And if it's all right with the panelists, we'll just go in order from left to right. Is that great? So thank you so much for being here, and Conrad, here you go.
Thank you. All right. Let's get going. So first of all, I just want to say that it has been a tremendous pleasure to be here at this conference. The level of discussion has been very high. The issues have been consistently stimulating, and just to be able to be here and to speak alongside people like Parker McQueenie, Douglas Lane, Tony Monteiro over here, incredible as well. Tremendously gratifying for me, especially because I live in Paris and I live in like a tiny apartment, and France is not the place where they even if they can sort of mumble out a few words of English, it's not the place where they read the most in English. So I was very gratified to discover that indeed there are people out there who have some awareness of what I've done, limited, but still there. And so that was a personal satisfaction for me. But let me get started out here. So did you guys see the last Democratic primary? So Sanders was obviously in a strong position, right? Key primary victories: New Hampshire, Nevada, California, Colorado. But I think what's clear in hindsight, right, when we consider those early victories, is that the Democratic establishment had effectively, planned. There were clearly contingency plans in place to deal with this, right? Because they didn't want a repeat, right, of what had happened with Trump in 2016, right? So I think this was sort of represented by this kind of let 1,000 centrist bloom strategy. That's what I like to call it. Of course, we had all kinds of people: gay Norwegian speaker Buttigieg, queen of carceral diversity Kamala Harris, etc. And, I think the real goal here was to, launch a fusillade of seemingly diverse centrist candidates in the goal of eventually condensing support around someone who could oppose Sanders. And, it's really striking when you think about this whole process that no Democratic primary contender has exited the race with the same level of support as Pete Buttigieg before Super Tuesday in modern primary history, right? Like, that's not just a coincidence, right? This is this is based on a very systematic organization, right, within the Democratic establishment to outmaneuver Sanders. I do believe, though, right? I think a lot of people are gonna, kind of embrace fatalism when it comes to this issue and say, well, there's no way Sanders ever could have done it, right? Couldn't happen, right? But I think, the reality is that there were tangible failures in the organization, right, that allowed the Democratic establishment to shut out Sanders as effectively as they did. And I think that we really saw that in terms of, Jim Clyburn in South Carolina, a failure to communicate to Southern black voters, right, adequately the sort of message of the Sanders campaign, as well as, a failure to communicate with a lot of the working classes of middle America. So again, with the DSA organizations, you had, a lot of sort of millennials, upper income, university educated in coastal cities, and that's just not adequate to get it done, right? And I mean, we could go even more into the details of this, right? I think Sanders' anti-establishment credentials were tarnished by his endorsement of Hillary. I think the grassroots was too urban and defined by university-educated graduates. I think support for narrow electoralism, it sort of distanced people from the populist energies they needed to tap into. I think we all remember like the jazz hands moment in the DSA, maybe not the organization's finest hour. But still, like even in loss, right? I think that Sanders still could have pointed the way forward, had he refused to back Biden. But instead he backed him, and like for basically nothing, right? Biden promised to expand Medicare coverage downward from 65 to 60, which is like Medicare coverage for an extremely rich demographic, right? In the peak of their income years, so that's a little strange. He also promised sort of piecemeal student debt relief, but excluded for-profit colleges, which is like where half of debt defaults are coming from, right? So these are really sort of garbage proposals. And I think the whole experience of seeing Sanders endorse Biden, then it was sort of like first his tragedy, then his farce, right? It was like, okay, we kind of went with you the first time, right? But now we know that this is a sort of collaborationist agenda. And actually, it's interesting to note that both the Medicare eligibility change and the cancellation of $10,000 in student debt seem to have been kind of lost in the void, as proposals, in spite of the Democrats controlling the House, Senate, and the presidency. So I don't know what that says. But I think really, if you look back at the whole situation, what would have been necessary, for the left to get ahead at that point is for Sanders to basically have sunk the Democratic Party. That's the only way that I think they could have even began to take the left seriously in any way, right? There's actually a friend of mine, Nestor Dibun, and he made some wonderful graphical mappings of different political scenarios in different countries to support the argument that what we needed to do was basically just crash the party at that point. And I do like to quote George W. Bush on this. He says that there's no point building up political capital if you're not going to spend it, right? So I like this metaphor between capitalism and, But one of the real problems with this is I feel like Sanders supporting Biden in the way he has made it difficult to criticize the COVID policies, in a way that they should have been criticized. And there's a lot of problems with Biden's COVID policies, right? Most obviously, this entire sort of endeavor was badly handicapped by Biden's failure to support Medicare for all. Which is absolutely bizarre to imagine, in the midst of this pandemic, now has killed 1 million people in the United States, that they were unable to do what almost every other developed country has done, right, and put in Medicare for all. But also we've seen, a lack of responsibility from the CDC under Biden, who sort of remain, as with Trump, muzzled, right? There hasn't been a lot of independent statements from the CDC. There hasn't been adequate mask mandates during Omicron. We've had these sort of scientifically dubious 5-day quarantine periods, lack of negative rapid tests needed for work, poor communication, and also just an insufficiently multifaceted response, right? I mean, this is what you saw with Trump, right? Where it was this silver bullet approach, right? We're gonna get the vaccine, everything's gonna be okay, right? In terms of the failure with the quarantine periods, with the testing, we've seen a repetition of that silver bullet strategy under Biden, right? I also want to add that while Biden pledged to donate $1 billion of COVID doses to other countries in December, as of 4 months later, only a third of those have actually been delivered. So we'll see if they actually make it. But in any case, given the failure of Biden's policies, I think what there really hasn't been is there hasn't been a voice, criticizing the government, not for the excessiveness of its mandates, because we know on the far right, there's been a lot of people saying, well, the mandates are totalitarian or whatever. But there hasn't been a voice criticizing Biden for not going far enough, right? I think that's been under-articulated, right? And I think this has sort of polarized things between, on one hand, this sort of very narrow defensive, negative liberty, if not, conspiracism. On the other hand, a defense of this sort of ostensibly scientific, but actually grossly inadequate COVID policy adopted by Biden during the pandemic. And in this respect, one should really contrast the US with China, right? I mean, China has the lowest rate of COVID deaths per millions in the entire world. That is the highest vaccination rate, and it was the only major economy to actually experience positive economic growth after the pandemic, right? It's also moved to address the economic effects of COVID, right? I mean, one thing we've seen with COVID is that digital commerce, right, has been very, very enlarged, right? Often at the expense of, small businesses and by extension to the people they employ. So we see that in China, they've done things, of course, dropping Jack Ma into the void, nationalizing tech companies, and announcing the new Common Prosperity policy, which, I think promises to create greater wealth equality in the country. But I think, in a way that Biden just continued Trump's policy, it really shows that, this wasn't, the failure to deal with COVID adequately wasn't just Trump's failure. The US has all the liabilities of any modern capitalist economy, right? Underfunded health services, turnover times that have been reduced to close to zero, disproportionate dependency on consumerism, and so on, albeit more so, right? Because of the relative withdrawal of the public sector. And so I really have to oppose myself to this kind of liberal narrative that prevents COVID is strictly a problem of right-wing populism, right? That's just not true. I mean, yes, we did see problems with Bolsonaro. We did see problems in the States with Trump. We also saw problems in, Spain and Belgium, in countries that do not fit that profile, right? So the issue here I want to stress is, neoliberalism as well as capitalism, right? But I think the real question here, right, we have to ask is what do we do now? Right, after all these failures, right, what do we do now? I think that the support given by the left to the likes of Sanders and AOC has really had the effect of dividing the, as it were, socialist left. And we've seen these interviews where AOC has attacked the sort of left deviation, in this way. So you can see the way that they're put in this perverse position, right? People like Sanders and AOC of having to defend Biden, right? Against, in certain respects, against his critics, right? So before Sanders backed Biden, I would really say that the U.S. left was divided into two camps. I think a kind of socialist one united behind Bernie, sometimes begrudgingly, and a kind of relatively fringe left communist one, particularly present in academia, right? So the left communist one, I think, is associated. We could talk about publications like EndNotes or the now deceased Commune, and I think it tends to be really quite hyper-liberal, as well as fetishistic with respect to kind of the riot form and the lumpen category. And sees in post-Fordist capitalism the possibility for a kind of spontaneous and immediate communization, right? And I'm channeling Daniel Tutt a little here with these remarks. But I think since Sanders' capitulation, we can see a new tendency emerging within that wants, within the DSA, for example, that wants to break with the Democratic Party, right? that doesn't want to hem toward either of these extremes, right? This open collaboration with neoliberal centrists, or toward, this sort of messianic left communist vector. And I think, I'm thinking here of the Marxist Unity Group, right? We have some of their members over here, who I really think point the way forward, more perhaps than anyone else in this current situation. So I think that, because of the particular issues confronting America, and we talked about the pandemic, we could also talk about, climate change, heightened automation, increased wealth inequality, even the average lifespan regressing, which is horrific, right? I think, there's actually a possibility for this sort of radical tendency to assert itself. But I want to make a few suggestions for it before I finish up. The first one is that, I disagree with the kind of messianic thinking that I do think is present within the left-com tendency. I think it's very important to absorb some of their insights. And this is especially true because we've seen a lot of powerful mobilizations within the last few years, right? From a Western standpoint, Black Lives Matter would be significant, but also I think the Gilets jaunes. And one can see these as potentially representing a new form of organization. I mean, organized labor is still essential, of course, but one that's going to help overcome the limitations of organized labor, within a post-industrial context. But here's where I think this kind of breaks down, right? These actual, protests have been very ideologically amorphous. I mean, we could talk, obviously, like about Adolf Reed and his critique of Black Lives Matter, but also, even with the Gilets jaunes, it was a mix of right and left, and was very, very anti-political in character, right? And therefore couldn't actually, mediate its demands and transform them into policy proposals. I think that's why we need, a party right now that's capable of transforming anti-political platitudes into a real program for socialist governance, right? Secondly, I think it's quite urgent right now to mend links between intellectuals and the left. And so it was interesting to talk about Kautsky's sort of merger formula yesterday a little bit. Obviously Lenin was acutely aware of the need to sort of use intellectuals to help activate the kind of latent capacity for revolution that we find within the working class. Though today we might speak actually of a reserve army of labor. But a lot of these links have been severed in the US due to a Red Scare that cut off labor unions from the intellectual class and the later triumph of post-structuralism, right, which really led to an idiom being propagated within academia, which was not Marxist, like Foucault, power or whatever. Okay. Yeah, I'll try to just like one, two, yeah, okay. And so the third thing I want to say, that we should be doing is I think we really, really have to, and it's going to be controversial, but I'll say it anyway. I think we really have to take seriously what's going on in China right now. And I think that, there has been, China's sort of gotten a bad rap, right, after the Cultural Revolution because of its use of markets. But we should remember that markets aren't the same thing as capitalism, right? And there are a lot of statistics which suggest China's economic model is substantially different than that in the West, right? Public investment to GDP, 16% per year compared to 3 to 4% in the US and the UK. 3 times as many public productive assets to private ones. About 96 of 124 of its biggest companies are public. So this is a very, very substantial difference from the US economy. So obviously, to talk about what China's done positively, isn't tantamount to advocating a model that's going to lead to the end of markets. But I think it does help us tackle the biggest problem we have today, which is really the rise of monopoly capital, right? Much of it speculatively driven and de facto funded with central bank money, to the point where now we've seen this total disarticulation between the organic economy and financial speculation. But I think, it's really the last thing I'm going to say. I think in a way we can see that there are 3 positions today in the world toward monopoly capital, right? The first one kind of in the US, right? Monopoly capital, let it go, right? It'll just dominate the world, right? It'll be run by Google, whatever. The second one I think is a kind of alt-right position, which is this sort of nostalgic vision for the restoration of individualist capitalism, as well as the kind of sovereignty and chauvinism it depends on. And I was thinking about Marjorie Taylor Greene referring to GoFundMe as corporate communists, right? And I think in a way the issue here is monopoly, right? Whether it's the monopoly of Facebook or whether it's the monopoly of the state, right? They've generalized this, at least rhetorically. And I think the third model is China, and China's model is basically that, Once a company reaches the level, where it graduates and becomes a monopoly, and a lot of monopolies are natural, right? You can't just break companies up all the time. That essentially it should become publicly controlled, right? And that demarcates a big difference. So to borrow a cute Maoist phrase, I think we could maybe refer to monopoly capital as the principal contradiction of our current capitalism. And obviously China has many faults, right? Its democratic mechanisms are in need of further development, particularly at the federal level, because municipally it actually is a very robust democracy. And it's not as welfarist as it could be, in spite of a high level of state economic control. So I think the question is, how do we, broadly speaking, follow the Chinese path, that is, move to eliminate private monopoly capital, while maintaining a level of popular mobilization sufficient to ensure this translates to social programming and a robust democratic structure? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I suspect that a lot of you all are getting tired of seeing my face at this point. Well, okay, thank you. But well, I have to admit, I don't know if I have a lot more to say than what I've already said. And if I repeat anything, forgive me. But the Biden administration is probably that administration in the last 100 years that has failed the most in the shortest amount of time. First of all, it comes into office claiming that it will progressively reshape the American capitalist social order. It will tax the rich. It will reform Obamacare. It will have a foreign policy that reflects the interests of the middle class. That it will protect the environment, that it will move gradually, at least it was suggested, to eliminating a lot of student debt. It would make child care for children at least of a certain age free. This was contextualized under the banner of Build Back Better. I guess we would say build capitalism back better. But the real agenda, as far as I'm concerned, is to reestablish American hegemony, to reverse the damage done by Trump and the Trump administration, to reestablish confidence and trust of the world's governments in American imperialism, in the American empire, that America ruled because America was democratic, and the values of America represented the aspirations of humanity. It was the neocon philosophical framing of foreign policy. And it goes back to Francis Fukuyama, the end of history, and the victory of liberalism, which they incorrectly call democracy. The question is, could we have gotten better from the 2020 election? My answer is no. There was a certain inevitability about what happened in 2020. I don't believe that Bernie Sanders was going to win, could win, and he acted, I think, pretty much after the Iowa primaries like a loser, like he and his people did not know what to do, and in fact, they didn't know what to do because they did not fully understand what they were up against. The question is then, what was Sanders up against? He was up against the united ruling class of the United States, situated in one of the major political parties of the country. I'd like to emphasize that again. Because Bernie Sanders and his people did not understand the workings of class and the positioning of this small part of the American people who are constituted as, well, we must call it the ruling class. Because Sanders and his people did not understand that, they could not win, would not win, and could not point the American people in the direction of what must be done if Sanders did not win. Let's put it another way. Sanders and his people do not now understand the nature of the crisis of the American system. They did not then and do not now understand the suffering of the American working class. They do not understand the depth of the anxiety and fears of working people. Like liberals in general, and the veil of socialism is merely a way of disguising what is in fact an attempt to rebrand liberalism, discredited liberalism. Sanders failed as a candidate because he failed ideologically. They do not understand, in fact, refused to understand what the left should understand, and that is that the great struggles of our time are the struggles of ideas. Whoever wins the ideological struggle wins the future. And whatever the weaknesses of the left in terms of numbers can be overcome by the power of ideas if we understand how to fuse the great potential of left intellectuals and activists with the profound and deep anxieties and anger of the masses. The left, which it has not done, sadly, the 2020 election, the 2016 election, maybe any election going back 30 years now, that our function is not to champion the lesser of evils, but to champion the interest of the working people. I think I said this yesterday. In the 1930s, in the organization of the industrial unions, steel, auto, electrical, trucking, railroads, the organization of the industrial unions, their slogan was a simple one: black and white, unite and fight. I like to point out they didn't say black and woke white people unite and fight. It was black and white unite and fight. It was a recognition that at a certain level, workers have common interest. The interest of the working class has to be fought for by somebody, by some political forces, even when it goes against what appears to be the most popular positions on the left. For example, the Sanders movement. I think we should be done with Sanders. Let him go. In fact, I believe he committed a number of transgressions against the left and all of us in this room. For example, when he referred to Hugo Chavez as a dead communist dictator. If he feels that way about Hugo Chavez, how does he feel about us? Is he calling for the death of left political leaders? So I think we should be done with him. And in being done with him, we are being done with the Democratic Party as such. It is a party beyond reform. The Democratic Party will never be the party of the New Deal. It is now the party of the richest sectors of American society. It is the party of the military, of the security state, of the most warlike ideologues in our country. It is the party, again, of the ruling class, and it organized and unified around it for the 2020 election. This was not a victory over fascism. In fact, I would argue, and I think the argument could be made, that in the 2020 election, the fascists won. Now, how do you make that judgment? First of all, what is fascism? At its core, fascism is a form of state organization and rule. So to understand fascism, you have to understand the bourgeois state. So it is not a judgment about whether somebody appears to be a fascist or can be made to look like Benito Mussolini. But the question is, what is the character of the state? And who is running the state? And finally, is it a democratic or a anti-democratic state? And I think there is no question that the state in the United States is more authoritarian and looks more like a fascist state than it has for decades. So the victory of Biden was not a victory for democracy. In the end, and I think this is going to be made clear to the American people, I think it might be more clear to the American people in many ways than it is to the left, that this will be a government of war and austerity. Certainly, it is an administration of war. But should we be surprised? Was this candidate not a return to Hillary Clinton and all that that represented, and of course the neocons? Let me end on this. Arthur Schlesinger, the great public intellectual and historian during the Kennedy administration, put forward the notion, and I think it was functional for a long period of time, that America is governed from the vital center. that we have elections, we have two parties and they compete, and after the election, they all come together to govern from a vital center. I don't think there's any question at this point, but the vital center has collapsed. So what does that say about governance in the United States? It literally, in my opinion, says that the country might be on the cusp of becoming ungovernable, where there is no vital center, and the sides in the political contest separate increasingly based upon class interest. This is what the neocons call our illiberal moment. I think the very idea itself confuses us, as though liberalism and the liberals are the Democrats. I mean, small d Democrats. In other words, they are the ones who fight for democracy. I would make the argument the opposite is the case. Therefore, what is to be done? We need a left in this moment of the collapse of the vital center, when the country is becoming increasingly ungovernable. We need a left that builds from the grassroots. I tried to say yesterday that we have models in American history that can teach us a great deal. For example, I always go back to the civil rights movement. A left that can find its way to the working class, to its communities, to its unions, to its churches, that can be in dialogue not with itself, but with the working class as a whole. With that, I'll end. Thank you very much.
I don't know.
Do you want me to?
I can use this one here.
Oh.
All right, yeah, this one's good. Okay. Thank you. Glad to be here, and very interested in this topic. So I think for a lot of people, including myself, we're in a strange historical moment, one that we've been in for a while, in which socialism is more popular than in anyone's, at least my living memory. I'm a Gen Xer, a child of the 90s. And so when I came to political age, basically third wave liberalism was all that existed, and history was supposedly over. And so I think, like a lot of us, the rise of DSA and the rise of socialism was intensely exciting. And yet I think to most observers, even DSA's and socialism's cheerleaders, such as Jacobin, understand that there's a kind of crisis going on right now. So the most recent Jacobin cover, it was 2 covers ago, anyways, was Socialism in Crisis, right? And so I think there's a general sense, if you're active on the socialist left, that there's a kind of slump. It's no secret that DSA meetings have been falling off somewhat in attendance, and there's a kind of disarray in terms of what DSA and other socialist organizations' projects are going to be. And so I think it's a good moment to reflect on, well, what is the crisis about? Where has the socialist moment come from? How is it like and unlike earlier socialist moments in the 20th and 21st centuries? And I think in some ways it's really useful to go back in history and to think about the way in which most socialist and left movements in this country tend to take the shape of capitalism to some degree that they're a part of, right? So Michael Denning's formation, which I really like, which was the Communist Party of the 1930s, which is, I have an enormous amount of nostalgia for, and somewhat of a red diaper baby. So I say some critiques of the Communist Party, fully supporting them. Anyways, but yeah, so the Communist Party, as Michael Denning framed it, was a kind of counterculture of Fordism, right? So the Communist Party in the US And I want to say very particularly the Communist Party in the US, right? So one of my kind of theses on the Communist Party is you can't talk about communism as being universal or the Communist Party as being universal. They tended to take the form of whatever state that they emerged out of, right? So the Communist Party of the United States was not very much like the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. However, there were some similarities. But in any case, Michael Denning suggests that the Communist Party is a kind of counterculture of Fordism. And if you think, what was Fordism? It was a kind of mass consumer base, a kind of capitalist centralization. It was nationally based. It was a kind of top-down bureaucratic technocracy, kind of rule of engineers, right? And so the Communist Party's incredible success in America, we have to think about it, the Communist Party achieved an enormous amount in this country. I mean, most of what we think about as the New Deal comes out of Communist Party organizing. Of course, as our comrade here to the right mentioned, the rise of the CIO and the organizing of large industrial capitalisms. And for a short moment, you could really talk about the CIO kind of running the shop floor, right, which is sort of their project ultimately. And then, of course, the beginnings of the civil rights movement really kind of start with the Scottsboro trial in the 1930s as well. And many of the kind of grandparents of the civil rights movement really got their training in the CP and in the old left. And so there's a lot to be incredibly proud of in the communist tradition. And of course, the CP was the only organization that actually raised an army and sent it overseas to fight against fascism, at least in the US. And it was also the first integrated army in the United States as well. But it also, again, was its form of success was also part of its crisis, right? So when the Cold War came and McCarthyism came, and of course when there were revelations about crimes of the Soviet Union, the top-down nature and kind of sclerotic and bureaucratic nature of the Communist Party in the US had a very difficult time responding to these challenges nimbly and dexterously, and with a great deal of self-reflection, right? So in certain moments, of course, when the Red Scare came, it was really sort of the CP hardliners that won out, and they just doubled down on what their message was, which kind of reflected the kind of culture of the Communist Party, this kind of top-down, kind of counterculture of Fordism that I think sort of shaped the CP from its origins. And I say this again, understanding the CP was probably the most successful left organization in the United States. And there's a lot, I think, to admire and possibly emulate about the old Communist Party, which still exists. I think we can also think about the rise of SDS as also taking a kind of structural homology or structural analogy to the kind of capitalism of the 1960s with its kind of managerial elite, kind of mass public education, and SDS sort of thinking themselves as an educational vanguard. One of my favorite SDS publications is by David Gilbert, hopefully will be released out of prison soon, or perhaps he's already, no, he's not out yet. Anyways, and it was a response to the Port Huron statement, and it was called the Port Authority Statement, which is one of my favorite kind of SDS jokes. Because basically they thought the Port Huron statement was too liberal, didn't have enough class focus, and so of course they wanted to name their sort of new manifesto after the bus station in New York City. And so the Port Authority Statement basically makes this kind of class argument about SDS. It says SDS is basically the emergence of this new cultural class, and kind of new, you could say, educated working class that now has a kind of avant-garde role to play on the left. And so on one level that led to SDS's successes, I mean, this kind of broad-based student movement, connections with the Black Panther Party, but also led to, of course, the kind of disaster of the Weather Underground, right? This group of socialists who thought of themselves as the avant-garde. These are people who are going to be leading society, and basically led SDS, into disarray in the late 1960s, right? So the final SDS convention, I think, was widely regarded as a disaster, as much as I'm also incredibly sympathetic to the kind of crisis that SDS was in, right? So they had been having these giant anti-war protests for years. They felt themselves disconnected from the working classes, obviously because the Red Scare had sort of killed a lot of the left of the labor unions, and so labor unions really divided about how to organize around the war. And so SDS fell into kind of a crisis of its own kind of structural analogy to the system that it was in. And I say this again, not to criticize these organizations. I'm a firm believer that the left does as good of a job as it can do, right? Like, if you ever go to socialist meetings, you go to union meetings, it's just ordinary people who are like taking time off of work to try to get something together, right? So, and so whenever I sort of criticize an earlier left historical moment or a current historical moment, I'm aware that it's like organizing anything. Organizing a party is hard, right? Like, I mean like a birthday party, let alone organizing a movement that's going to overthrow capitalism. So I realize that everybody is doing the best they can, right? And so when there are crises, it is because they're in a situation in which the left is, generally speaking, fighting against powers that are well beyond its control and ability to confront, and of course the own contradictions of their cultural formation. And so, you could say that the New Left fell apart also at this time that basically, neoliberalism began its new assault. The capitalism started changing its forms, and the old modes of organizing no longer seemed like they were viable, right? So after SDS, a lot of people went into basically organizing rank-and-file unionism, right, in the 1970s, the sort of, colonizer strategy or salting strategy. And of course, this is the exact same moment people were trying to organize in unions, these kind of left factions in unions, at the very moment that the industrial working class was being disorganized by capital, right? Sort of moved first down south and then overseas. And so flash forward about 30 years, and actually I don't think the beginning of our kind of left moment is really DSA. I think our beginning of our left moment is really the kind of first big protest against capitalism that happened in the late 90s, which was kind of my introduction to left organizing, which was the global justice movement. First the battle in Seattle, and then of course the protests against the IMF, and then sort of globe-hopping anti-globalization protests or global justice protests that really sort of started this archipelago of kind of vibrant social movements that have been reacting, I think, in the same way the CP and SDS reacted against its historical moment, have been reacting against neoliberalism and global capitalism. And I think there's a lot of ways in which the sort of archipelago of social movements that starts in the late 90s and early 2000s is on some level structurally analogous to the kind of capitalism that we're fighting, right? This is actually noticed and observed a great deal during the global justice movement, that it looked, the Battle of Seattle looked a lot like the internet, people said. This was sort of Naomi Klein's point, right? That it looks actually like the sort of disorganized model of capital that we have now, the sort of just-in-time production, disarticulated working class, small factories moving all over the world. And on some level, the sort of spokes council, affinity group model, kind of flash mob style protests looks a lot like the sort of nimble capitalism on some ways that the global justice movement was trying to oppose. And I think also speaks to the real kind of disorganization of the working class since the sort of advent of neoliberalism, right? So one of the things that made the Communist Party really successful was that it organized out of stable working class neighborhoods in big cities, right? Again, my grandparents were, neighborhood communists in their, kind of working class Jewish neighborhood.
In what city?
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia.
Yeah, Philadelphia. Yeah. So,
There's a couple more minutes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we can talk later. Yeah, okay. So maybe my grandparents knew you. Well, they're in West Philly, so yeah. So I don't. Yeah, I haven't. Yeah, okay. You will. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Anyways.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so, where was I? Lost in nostalgia. Thank you, yes, okay. So I say that this moment of sort of the working class is disarticulated and disorganized by neoliberalism and by globalization. You don't have these giant factories, although actually now with the victory in Amazon, perhaps the old mold of history is returning. But like I said, there's this notion that you have factories of tens of thousands of people all across the country that are sort of organized by capital itself, right? I mean, capital is this thing that actually organizes the working class in a way into large spheres, at least in the 1930s and 40s, into sort of large groups that then the Communist Party and other left organizations could go and organize. So we're in this moment in which the working class itself is quite disarticulated, very mobile, and actually on some level, doesn't necessarily identify itself as working class. It identifies itself through a number of different subcultures, right? And I think this is readily available when you sort of go on Twitter or go on social media. And so DSA comes out of this contradiction, right? So that socialism is quite popular. There's a sense that capitalism is in crisis, but this notion that there's a stable base to organize out of is a very difficult thing to try to accomplish. And I think on some level, DSA has, kind of like the global justice movement, kind of like Black Lives Matter, kind of like the immigrant rights movement, kind of like the anti-war movement, these movements of the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, DSA is very good at organizing around single issues, right? So, the Medicare for All campaign, organizing, electing socialists in Chicago, even electing socialists to Congress, or doing rent control campaigns. DSA has actually been fairly successful at doing these kinds of campaigns. But when it comes to a crisis that is out of anybody's, sort of known historical world, like the COVID crisis, then DSA, and I think like much of the left, has been caught rather flat-footed because there's no sort of organic basis from which to organize. And I say this as somebody who goes to DSA meetings and has been trying to talk to people about like, what do we do about the pandemic, And so I think rather than, saying, the left today is bad or is corrupt or is worse than other lefts, I think the way to think about it is the left is facing today a different contradiction of capital than earlier lefts, and we're trying to figure it out as we go along. And I think the one exciting part about the left right now is that it really is kind of free of a lot of sort of old ideological baggage. I have a lot of friends who are in the ISO, and I sort of thought it was really kind of this paradox that the ISO collapses at the very sort of moment that DSA comes into being. And I don't say this is, again, a critique of the ISO, but I think the DSA has like faced an enormous number of scandals, from personal scandals to, candidates backing all kinds of horrible things that would have collapsed another socialist organization. But DSA is so ideologically floppy and decentralized, you actually can't kill it, in this way, right? You can't actually collapse it because it is really decentralized, right? So DSA is whatever that DSA group in that particular town happened to be doing. And so that on some level is its weakness, but it also is something I think that gives us a kind of flexibility and nimbleness to try to organize some kind of new left out of kind of the ashes of the old. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't have any other solutions other than go to a meeting, and try to get organized wherever you are. I think that's what socialists have always done all of their lives. And I think DSA and other socialist groups like, Socialist Alternative, are trying it out. Like they're trying new things out. And I think, again, they're doing what the left has always done, is taking the crisis that they're in and trying to figure out a new path, given all of the sort of hurdles and faults that are in our path. So again, I don't have any grand solutions. Also, maybe as a historian, I hate to sort of tell anyone what to do. I can only sort of say what has happened. But like I said, I'm not. I was actually feeling rather desperate last week and feeling that everything is in crisis. And then, of course, Amazon workers win this historical election. So who knows? Maybe history is more open than we think. So anyways, I have no further comments. I will pass it on. Right.
Would you be more comfortable if I keep the mask on?
Oh, yeah, go for it. Yeah, go for it.
That actually led very well into what I'm going to talk about in terms of the left at the time being a reflection of the form of capitalism. And my remarks are going to be more about how the left should investigate its own complicity in the reconstitution of capitalism through that. So to go back to the prompt, we were asked how could the COVID crisis have presented an opportunity for the left to break with the politics of the Democratic Party? I'm going to say that the pandemic did not present an opportunity for the left to break with the Democratic Party's politics in the United States or in the rest of the world. I can only speculate about how the Millennial Left, the generation radicalized by the anti-war movement, Occupy Wall Street, and the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign, might have started the ideological and organizational spadework necessary to politicize the coronavirus outbreak and public health response. To do so would have required them to draw different lessons from both the events of their own lifetimes and to question the historical education they received from their elders in the sectarian left, the activist groups, and the academy. Just to be clear, I'm talking in very general terms here. There's obviously exceptions within any of these groups, and using terms, like millennial or so on is, a broad brush to paint with.
Could you speak up a bit?
Yes.
Just hold it towards your phone.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. So personally, I've grown up alongside the Millennial Left and am part of it in a way. I started paying attention to politics at the tail end of the ultra-globalization movement, the global justice movement that Benjamin was talking about. And I started to get serious about politics during the anti-war movement when I was in high school. From that starting point, I've been able to watch my generation's digestion of 3 significant moments of 20th century and early 21st century history. During the lead up to the Iraq War, and after the war became an occupation, we were looking to the lessons of the New Left with an eye on how the opposition to the Vietnam War remade American and international society. The 2007-2008 financial crisis and Occupy Wall Street brought to mind the Great Depression and the Roosevelt administration's progressive liberalism as a model. And the short-lived revival of social democracy in Europe with Syriza, Podemos, in Britain with Corbyn, and the United States with the Sanders campaigns of 2016 and 2020, continued the affirmation of the New Deal moment and provided the illusion that we've overcome the anarchistic 1990s protest left. Despite these being distinct developments in capitalist politics, the left drew similar lessons from each event and the history these crises brought forward. The common feature is an understanding of the left as mobilizing civil society to exert pressure on the state so that the state in turn can transform society. What this translates to is getting people in the streets with sufficient numbers and militancy. They could be out there knocking doors for Bernie, organizing tenants for Acorn, protesting war, police violence, and so on. The aim is to force concessions from the state, or to empower progressive sections within the government over the reactionary forces with whom they are locked in a seemingly permanent, inconclusive combat. This problem goes back to the history of the Second International and the opportunist debate, and then again, the split in the International during World War I. But for American socialists, the most consequential event and the source of this ongoing historical motivation is the New Deal. So Jacobin, for example, constantly mentions the Biden administration, or measures the Biden administration against FDR. And they find it lacking because Build Back Better doesn't do anything to mobilize or organize labor and the unemployed so that they can make Build Back Better even better ways to build back better. It's also worth recalling the high hopes for Barack Obama's ultimately disappointing first 100 days, which I think people who were in Chicago and elsewhere in Platypus might recall from the recreation of the SDS. And the ultimate disappointment of that was contrasted to FDR's extensive legislative agenda at the start of his presidency. So if we measure today's mediocre politicians against the yardstick of the New Deal's accomplishments and find them unimpressive, it's also worth noting how Marxists who lived through the New Deal evaluated it in relation to the struggle for socialism. Almost 90 years later, we have thoroughly naturalized the association of the administrative state and socialism. In the United States, both the Stalinists and the Social Democrats ultimately wound up supporting the expansion of the welfare warfare state, however critically. But the demand for independent civil social organization, outside and opposed to the capitalist parties, transformed eventually into a complaint against the inadequacy of the state's public relief measures, the concessions it made to the right, or the diversion of resources from one sought-after program to warfare or tax cuts or whatever else. To paraphrase a headline from The Militant, the weekly newspaper of the Socialist Workers' Party, the socialists went from asking who taxes to who is taxed and how much are they taxed. The question of power was left aside. In contrast to the Stalinists and Social Democrats, Trotsky and his followers viewed the growth of the state, including its attempt to absorb its opposition, as the culmination of monopoly capitalism and imperialism. Richard Hofstadter, who's not a Trotskyist, said that Teddy Roosevelt's government claimed to be neutral by offering special favors to no one. Franklin Roosevelt's claimed to be neutral by offering special favors to everyone, including the traditional constituencies of the left, like the labor movement. And that's the example that comes to mind for me is the National Labor Relations Act, which legalized trade unionism, both in the sense that it made it easier for unions to organize and win better contracts for their members, but also incorporated labor unions into a regulatory framework that made the state the final arbiter in disputes between workers and management. In his essay, which was found on his desk after he was murdered by a Stalinist assassin, Trade Unions in the Epoch of Imperialist Decay, Trotsky said, "In the United States, the Department of Labor, with its leftist bureaucracy, has as its task the subordination of the trade union movement to the democratic state." This is why Farrell Dobbs, a Trotskyist who organized the Teamsters' massive 1930 growth in membership in the Midwest through the Over the Road campaign and the Minneapolis General Strike, would end meetings with prospective union members by saying, "Don't arbitrate," instead of "goodbye." For Dobbs and other Trotskyists, unions had to be schools of socialism pointing towards the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which required Marxist leadership. So to return to the present after foray in the 1930s, the pandemic has been a teachable moment for me on the failures of the left and the approach of the left that I've been outlining today. What happens to an approach aiming to influence the state through popular, from-below mobilization when the bread and butter of political activity, meetings, protests, private, up-close conversations in the workplace, all are treated as a potential threat to public health? To ask the question, I think, is to answer it. The measures taken to manage the pandemic confronted the left with an apparently simple choice between compliance and defiance. But to meaningfully defy the bureaucracy's diktats, the left would have to be in a position to take responsibility for society, which would have required the sort of work that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks. I don't think anyone wants to just pretend that there's not a virus out there and that you don't have to behave responsibly. But on the other hand, that would require, a sort of long-term process of building organizations that are independent. But by the time the reports of a new SARS outbreak transformed into cascading lockdowns, the left had nothing new to say. As some citizens began to chafe under the new restrictions, the left joined the public and private sector health bureaucracies in blaming the non-compliant for the virus's continued spread. The left's inability to articulate an alternative to the state's pandemic management plan, let alone organize one, meant that the plebeian right channeled the dissenters' frustration into its familiar attack on the nanny state, or big government, or whatever else. Since the Reagan Revolution, the automatic response to the rhetoric of individual responsibility has been that the needs of the many outweigh the complaints of the few. So most radicals doubled down on statism, although they distinguished themselves from the centrists by demanding real lockdowns, deeper labor union coordination in implementing health and safety measures, and perhaps a more equal distribution of misery among the rich and the poor. But I don't want to overstate how many aggrieved citizens found a way to express their opposition in a conscious or political manner, even in the cranky form of conspiracy theories and rowdy protests. In general, the neoliberal moment has seen a thinning out of civil society, which has kind of led to this mass shrug in the face of new restrictions on personal liberties. Many of my coworkers, for example, which is at a meatpacking facility in an industry that has been hit fairly hard with coronavirus, experienced both the pandemic and the public health measures, which they detested, like it was just more bad weather. Worthy of some complaint. The word kurwa is said a lot there. I don't know if anyone speaks Polish, but maybe this is kind of part of a fatalistic national character on many of my Eastern European colleagues, but it also expresses a recognition of the total lack of proposed alternatives and public discussion. Where I live in Ontario, most of my coworkers who tend towards the conservative side voted for our conservative populist premier, who wound up implementing the exact same measures as liberal premiers or our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. So where's the choice? If, as some conspiracy theorists say, COVID's prepared the possibility for some form of neo-serfdom in the Great Reset, the slogan they like to use is, "You'll own nothing and you'll be happy." The state's overreach has been met with opposition, which only brings to mind the old peasantry, with its surly, passive resistance and occasional chaotic uprising. So where does this leave us now? Once again, I'll return to the 1930s. It's a comfortable place for me. Evaluating the 10th Congress of the Communist Party of the United States, the Trotskyist writer Max Shachtman said in a typically biting essay that the Stalinists had rejected the Marxist understanding, quote, of periodic economic crisis being inherent and inevitable in capitalist society, regardless of the wishes or politics of the ruling class. And they replaced it with the brand new discovery that it is not capitalism that engenders crisis, but rather that, and here he's quoting Earl Browder, who was the General Secretary of the Communist Party, every economic crisis is the result of the policies of the capitalist class. What this amounted to, in Shachtman's words, was to make the Communist Party, if not the saviors of the bad policy, bad capitalists, then at least the personal physician of the capitalist system. I would suggest that any new beginning needs to reject the position of playing doctor to a patient who's oblivious of your existence, and question the claim that a century of our efforts have improved the patient's prognosis.
Much to all of our panelists for their remarks. At this time, I'd like for each of you to take about 2 minutes to voice any responses you have to your fellow panelists. We'll go in the same order that we spoke.
Sure. And before I get to the responses, I just want to say that if you enjoyed what I said before, I just published, it's a republished version of a manifesto I wrote called Manifesto for Post-Pandemic Politics, and that is currently available on Cosmonaut, just out today. So I encourage you to go online and take a look. I know Tony was a fan, which flattered me so much. So, but anyway, that's there. But the first thing I wanted to say was I wanted to respond to Benjamin Balthaser and maybe just put some of our points in harmony, because you're talking about the way that there's this sort of symmetry sometimes, right? Between the states in which Marxist movements arise or revolutionary movements, and the content of those movements themselves. And I think this is very, very profitable. Of course, there's so many examples we can give, right? And I was even thinking about China, right? How they rewrote the lyrics to the folk songs, right? As like revolutionary songs, and so many parallels in this way. And also just the fact that if we look at 20th century communist regimes, right? Often, this authoritarianism is decried as if it's a specific feature of communism itself. But none of these countries were democratic, right? Before they became, whether we're talking about China, Cuba, the USSR. So there's obviously a question of historical foundation that has to be discussed. But I think with respect to monopoly capital, it's actually a really interesting thing to talk about, because I think that there is sort of a dual challenge. Because I think again. And I'm thinking here about, it could be in different contexts, but I'm thinking here about sort of the Chinese strategy of, okay, well, we're going to nationalize or publicly exert control over companies once they reach the monopoly stage. And I think on one hand, you can see that there's a symmetry with private monopoly capital, which is necessary to exercise that kind of function. But at the same time, it's like you also don't want to just be stuck, within the limits of bureaucratic capitalism, right? And I think, in a way, yeah.
Sorry, excuse me.
Oh yeah. Well, I think in a way, the Cultural Revolution had a similar relationship to sort of Stalinist bureaucratic socialism, right? China had sort of aped those institutions, and then it was like, how do we get out of it? But I think today the problem is a little bit different, because I think now you have this policy of nationalization, in most major industries in China, aviation, tobacco, whatever, publicly controlled. But I think, the big challenge today is how do we go beyond that logic, and particularly how do we go beyond that logic when the movements, which had, unfortunately, very sort of liberal leadership, but movements like Tiananmen, which potentially had the potential to infuse life, right, into that sort of, policy of nationalization, were sort of rooted out by the government. So I think that's an interesting question for today. And I also just want to add quickly, your name was? Cam
Hardy.
Cam Hardy, okay. I wanted to add, with your, I guess I just worry a little bit with the way you're approaching the issue of the welfare state, because I think that, it reminds me like what Balthaser says in On Contradiction. It's like, there can be a kind of Hegelian tendency to want to simplify the contradiction, right? To say we just have to have a pure contradiction, between capital and labor, And if we have something like a welfare state, that's mitigating those tensions, therefore it's anti-revolutionary. It's a very, very simplistic approach. But I think we should also, take in mind what Balthaser says, for example, about the fact that both in Marx's political works, as well as in the actual history of socialism, it hasn't been the purification of the contradiction between labor and capital that's led to revolutionary tensions. It's actually been when there's a multitude of contradictions operating at the same time, right? And we can see that in Russia, for example, or China. These were not the regions where the tension between capital and labor was at its pinnacle. Again, I think with the welfare state, actually the experience of the welfare state in a lot of respects was that it didn't diffuse that tension, right? We could talk about civil rights in the United States, right? All the mobilizations of the 60s. We could also talk about, someone like Peter Meidner in Sweden, who was legitimately trying to build a model, right, where unions would buy the companies they worked for, right? America did intervene into Swedish politics to try to stop it. England, where especially after the oil crisis, capitalists were threatening to withdraw, from investment, withdraw from the market, because, the social state was so elaborate that they could barely make profit, right, with the unions and with the redistribution. So these are real serious contradictions and tensions. And I think when you just say, oh, well, this is all just, sort of Bonapartism or whatever, I really don't think you do justice to the complexity of that period. So those would be my comments. Thanks.
Yeah, my comments are very simple. I think that where I would disagree with my colleagues here is that I would ask the question, what was the great democratic movement of the second part of the 20th century? And what can we learn from it? And I would answer the great democratic movement of the second half of the 20th century was the Black Freedom Movement. And the next question is, what can we learn from it? And I guess my advice is that it must be studied, because my observation is that while we here know a lot of things and a lot about certain things, we know very little about that part of our common history and our common heritage. In many ways, we are today what we are as Americans in this country because of that great movement. It was transformative and world historic. And it is, I think, a sign of the poverty of the left that it does not recognize or understand that fact. I call it the Black Freedom Movement because that's what the participants and the vanguard of it essentially called it, a Black Freedom Movement, which democratized American capitalism to the furthest extent that it could be under capitalist relations of production. And that is by solving the outstanding problem of both American revolutions, the 1776 and Civil War Reconstruction period, the question of the status of African Americans, including this vast and profound section of the working class, to resolve the question of are they citizens in a bourgeois democracy. I think we face problems not unlike those confronted by the civil rights movement. Some people get it wrong. Oh, the civil rights movement merely wanted to integrate black people into capitalism. I think if you study it in detail, what you will discover is the opposite. It wanted to transform the society, in many ways to transform American capitalism along lines of the New Deal, which would have, as my colleagues here have mentioned, raised new contradictions that themselves would have to be resolved. But I find it a problem of our historical consciousness, not to understand that great moment of our history. And I'd like for somebody to help me understand why we don't understand it as a great moment of our American history. Indeed, the period of the 1930s, and as I've said before, I was a member of the Communist Party. I won't say I find it a little bit offensive that the great sacrifice and labor of tens of thousands of Americans are dismissed with the term Stalinist. I find that to be sadly a dismissal of so much that was great, was essential. I agree with Ben. I mean, when you point out what people did, but to dismiss it as a kind of adjunct to a alleged repressive regime in the Soviet Union does not help us to gather the right lessons from that period. In a lot of ways, in calling the Communist Party Stalinist and dismissing so many people in that way, what are we saying about Paul Robeson, the great internationalist? What are we saying about W.E.B. Du Bois? And what are we saying about Angela Davis? In fact, what are we saying about the Black Panther Party? Did they see something that we do not see? Did they understand history in ways that we do not understand it? Did their experience lead them to conclusions different from what our experiences have led us to? And of course, the final test of all theory, I believe, I don't know whether we all agree with this, is practice itself. What have we achieved? What have we done? Who have we mobilized? And what have we changed? I think that's the question that is before us. And do we have the courage? Here I agree with Benjamin. This is not a small matter if you say you want to form a party. It's not a small matter to be in a party. I'm not just talking about a liberal or social democratic, I'm talking about a revolutionary party that challenges the state. You set high stakes for yourself, and it is a greater task than I think we realize. It is more than talking about history, it is making history. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess that was one key word that keeps coming up in this conversation is failure, failure of the left, success and failure. And those are actually terms I don't like very much. What does it mean that the left has failed? What does it mean the left has succeeded? One could say the Reconstruction failed. However, of course, the Civil War is the only successful revolution this country really ever had, right? So what does success and failure in that sense mean, right? What does it mean that we say the left has failed historically? Well, I mean, the left has failed at pretty much everywhere. So, I mean, we live in a state, obviously capitalism is still ascendant. However, at the other side of this, since we're talking about COVID, a lot of people have said that, well, these old Stalinist regimes, these autocratic socialist states are clearly, obviously total failures, right? Cuba China, these are not, models of democracy. Yet they're the only two, some of the only places that have actually managed to save massive numbers of human life during a pandemic, and America has led the world with 1 million deaths. And so one says, well, maybe Cuba is actually really a successful socialist state. I don't really know. Obviously, like I said, trying to take a Cuban model to the United States and bouncing revolution off of, a third-rate gangster dictator is probably not what we're going to do here. But nonetheless, like I said, what is a success and what is failure is something that I try to keep a pretty open mind about and understand that we're constantly walking through contradictions that we ourselves, at best, are dimly seeing, right? And so when we say the Sanders campaign was a failure, obviously on some level it was an absolute disaster, right? Sanders is clearly not the standard bearer of any socialist project, and DSA, I think to some degree, is not really thinking about Bernie Sanders or Bernie Sanders-like candidates as their own avant-garde for the most part, at least at the grassroots level in Chicago. However, at the same note, it's really hard to think of the Sanders campaign as something that didn't change the minds of a lot of people, raise expectations, express frustrations, inspire a lot of new organizing from people at their own workplaces up through electing socialists at the municipal level. So Sanders' success or Sanders' a failure, or Sanders just, again, someone who walked into a contradiction in which we have a kind of failed liberalism right now that everyone knows is a failure. Mm-hmm. At the same time, the state is doubling down on its autocratic and fascist tendencies, if not actually fully born, So, and so again, I kind of want to just, when people are saying, well, the left has failed, or the left is a failure, or this project failed, or that project failed, I just want to open our minds a little bit to say, as somebody who has been active on the left, for the last 25 years, it's very hard, and I think every generation deals with its own failures. And so I think the question I would throw out to us is, well, what are you going to do about it, right? What are you going to build? What meeting are you going to go to, right? So, and how are we going to really kind of internalize the fact that we're living in a kind of spectacle of mass death that we're shrugging off right now, which is something that literally keeps me up at night. Going back to the point about the Black freedom struggle, obviously the COVID pandemic has been, I think, the last kind of in a series of retrenchments against the Black freedom struggle, as many people have pointed out. If you're white, middle class, and without a serious disability, probably you're going to be fine, right? And statistically speaking, white middle class people are doing rather well in the pandemic. Everybody else is fucked. And so, to put it very simply, and so obviously the pandemic has been another site in which we can see the sort of a kind of racial retrenchment and class retrenchment, right? So that's happened in the last couple of years. And so hopefully we can find a socialist answer to it. But like I said, it's been a sign of our current crisis. Okay, sorry, enough of my rambling. Thank you. I'll pass this over. So.
Okay. There's a little bit there, I think, that was addressed to me. So in terms of Stalinism, I'm obviously it's a little pejorative, but if you look at, for example, the 1938 report that Earl Browder wrote on the convention that Shachtman was describing, he proudly calls them a Stalinist party. He says the Lovestonites and Trotskyists called us Stalinists, and he's our helmsman. He's continuing the tradition of Lenin and Marx and Engels. We're Stalinists. So I don't think it's too far from the truth to describe the party in the 1930s as Stalinist. Which actually brings me to reminds me of something from Benjamin's opening remarks, which describing the U.S. Communist Party as kind of top-down, maybe one of the better understatements I've heard about.
I have a direct response.
Oh.
You said what did you say, Ben?
I said I have a direct response. I was just kidding. Keep going. Sorry.
Yes. So, I think one of the areas of disagreement that we have in general here is the standard of achievement and how you judge success and failure. And my starting point would be the goals that people set for themselves. which relates to what Conrad was saying to me about the welfare state and reforms and whether those diffuse the potential of socialism and whatnot. And I don't think you need Althusser to say that it's nice to have some of the things the welfare state offers. I'm currently on parental leave because Canada's welfare state is comparatively generous compared to the the stinginess that happens down here. But that is also largely immaterial to this idea of the struggle for socialism. It's nice, but it's not the same thing as the goals that Marxists at the start of the 20th century would have set for themselves. And then in terms of the fight for reforms, I think it's not about being dismissive of that, even though sometimes my tone, just from how I talk, makes it sound dismissive. It's important, but what's important is not as much what you actually get done, but how that fight shapes the organization that you're building and how it develops the consciousness of the working class, this is like the basic observation of the transitional program, is that the transition that takes place is from reformist consciousness to revolutionary consciousness. And that is partially through the fight for reforms. The success of COVID policies in authoritarian, or the actually existing socialism of Cuba and China and so on, and this I think ties back to the standard we're talking about of how you measure success. Cuba's COVID response, there's a lot of impressive parts to it. Whether that makes Cuba a state that you want to emulate is a separate question. There's a lot of other issues with the Cuban state. I'll leave it at that.
I don't want to be piggy. Nobody else got a direct response, so.
If you have a direct response, go ahead, and then we'll open up for questions.
Thank you, that's very kind of you. Do you mind?
Yeah,
okay,
go
thanks.
for it.
Okay. Just a direct response. The Communist Party in the U.S. was rather complicated, and I think was a kind of prime example of an organization that was formed by grassroots pressure coming basically organizing at the street level and a kind of direct democracy and top-down organizational structures. And I think, there's a lot of new history that came out of the 1990s, kind of re-looking at the Communist Party from the grassroots up. So, Randy Storch's book on Chicago, Robin Kelly's work, Mark Nason's book on Harlem. And I think, you really have to look at these social movements at a granular level. What do people do on the street? What do people do in factories? What do people do in unions? And you find it's often a much more complicated story than the sort of top-down Stalinists. That was sort of the old story told by, I'm blanking on the historian's name. But anyways, Draper, thank you. So by Draper, tag team. So appreciate it. Anyways, that's my direct response. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. So,
Thank you so much to all of the panelists, and now we're going to open it up to audience discussion. I saw a million hands raised at once. I will try and get to as many people as I can. And I'm going to be, since we just have the two mics, I'm just going to go ahead and walk with the mic to people, and we can do it that way.
So I guess this question would be addressed. Apologies about that. I guess this question would be directly to Cam Hardy. How can we not see sort of like COVID as a crisis of liberalism onto itself? Because like the United States being sort of like this kind of like nation that is like the heart of liberalism, really, like the sort of like spreader of this disease, is floundering in the face of this real and visceral crisis. of a pandemic, it begs asks like sort of this fundamental question about how like this sort of like worldview can remain stable in the face of like these large scale crises, and in particular the way in which like its concept of freedom as like sort of autonomy, alien individuals from each other, like feeds into like the particular crisis, like a pandemic, which requires a certain level of like societal influence and like on like the lives of individuals, and like cooperation, which is fundamentally opposed to like this liberal conception of freedom.
Yeah. Sorry, there's going to be some mic passing.
We only have two.
I think what I was trying to address in my remarks, and maybe I didn't do it as clearly as I could have, is that the prospect of a socialist party, like a dynamic civil social organization, would cut across that dichotomy of statism and personal irresponsibility or responsibility. I don't deny that people behave like jerks and people do a lot of silly things. I see it all the time. But the change coming from within society and not being implemented by the state, I think, is the thing to consider.
Any other panelists, if you want to respond, by the way, just let me know. More people than move the questions.
Can I ask you a question? Could people, when they speak, pull their masks down? I think we could hear them better.
Yeah, speak them better. I think that's okay when you're speaking. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I thought that after Cam's comments, there seemed to be a common agreement among the first three speakers. So I wanted to figure out if that was the case. It seems like Cam posed the question of whether or not the goals of the left is to make society responsible for itself, right? The left takes up responsibility for society as opposed to appealing to the state. And that one of the problems that's raised by the New Deal is the appeal to the state as the end-all be-all, the one that somehow is going to create the room for socialism. Later on, it seems like what was implied was that the state is the only one organized effectively for the kind of harm reduction, and the specter of mass death was brought up. But isn't it the case that society itself, that socialists want to organize people to take responsibility for society so as to drive those forces towards a kind of potential realization of the forces that capitalism directs towards death and destruction? But that's not going to happen through the state. I just wondered if was that a common agreement, or did I misunderstand or mischaracterize that?
So go ahead, man. You started.
Did you want to? Okay. That's a really excellent question, a really excellent point. I've been thinking a lot about Ernesto Klau's work on populism, because I think it really informs on some level some of the crises in socialism right now. And he makes the point that populism, unlike kind of other working class movements that might be organized autonomously through independent unions, populism requires the state in order to recognize a subject, right? And that's actually the kind of the problem that DSA and other socialist organizations have, that since the working class is historically disorganized in the US right now, campaigns against the state are actually the way in which socialism organizes itself as a subject, right? And that's, of course, what DSA did when it first started reorganizing in 2016, which was to define campaigns that would define the working class, right? So when DSA organized in Chicago, and I was part of helping create the South Side branch, we said, okay, how are we going to constitute ourselves as a subject, as a working class subject in Chicago? Well, we're going to have a rent control campaign, and that will actually help organize a working class on the South Side of Chicago. But that also requires a state to kind of bounce your sense of identity off of, right? And of course, you can't have a pandemic response without a state, right? Because the state is really the only thing that can mobilize these kinds of resources. The contradiction in that, however, is that what happens when the state is entirely and totally committed to a politics of mass death, as gentlemen here on the right suggested, Biden and Trump's policies are actually fairly similar, even if Biden is less rhetorically offensive. And so what happens when you have a state that is entirely in concert and consensus that they don't care that 1 million people have died, right? And so it becomes very hard to actually constitute a subject, which I think has been kind of the problem with kind of COVID organizing since COVID started 2 years ago. And I think that's been one of the kind of crises about organizing or constituting a subject in this kind of neoliberal, kind of post whatever, many things age. So anything else? Yeah.
Please speak up. Try and hold the mic closer.
Oh, sorry. Could you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, just about the question about popular responsibility versus state responsibility. I mean, I think it would already be a mistake to simply juxtapose these things.
Yeah.
Right? I think really, like, if you look at, the ubiquity of state organization, state-based organization in the 20th century, I mean, this is developed, in the context of wartime. Eventually it's wielded as a way of staving off the severity of the economic contradictions which affect capital. And in some sense, in terms of the usage of the state, we see it, though it's different how it's used. We do see a certain constancy if we look at, actually existing socialism, welfarist capitalism and fascism, right? But I think that, if you look at, again, when talking about the experience of the welfare state in the United States, I think that the reality is that this was deployed as an attempt to neutralize the contradictions which had emerged between labor and capital. But I think the problem here, right, is when you start to do things like educate people en masse, right, and when you start to do things like give people more free time, that produces new contradictions.
Absolutely.
Right, and it actually incapacitates people in a way that allows them, right, to take more responsibility in that way. I mean, if we had went toward like this sort of Keynesian vision, right, like 15 hours a week of work, I can guarantee you that we would be in a situation where capitalism would be very hard for it to survive, right? And not just on the level of profitability, right? Were it the case that we had to redistribute that extensively, right, within our economy. So I think that it's already a false binary to pose the question in those terms, and I don't think it's a productive one. So.
Yeah, no, let's have more questions. I agree with him.
I want to just a quick response to that. I'm not entirely sure what the contradiction that emerges from people having more free time necessarily is, or from education. And maybe this is the cynic in me, but I really question whether people are smarter than they were 100 years ago. Whether the availability of mass public education has actually made people more intelligent. I think there's probably more literacy, but there's also, there was all sorts of cultural institutions that I'm sure, Benjamin, here you're aware of, that used to exist that no longer do. This is something that's well documented in the history of the working class movement. The efforts at self-education, self-improvement that working class organizations put together themselves. And the state involvement in education is something that emerges out of that same time period. And to some extent, like for example in Britain, it emerges as an alternative to the Chartists organizing their own schools, for example.
Tony, if I may, Anthony, in your open remarks, though, you did talk about fascism and the bourgeois state. And so I think this question of how do Marxists or socialists or how should the left orient towards the capitalist state?
Absolutely.
That you might have something to say about that. Because at the same time in your opening remarks, you mentioned that the civil rights movement transformed reality, transformed American society by a kind of, in a similar way to the New Deal, or that it took up the New Deal in certain respects, which of course is a policy of the capitalist state. So I do think that Pam's question, I would like to hear you say something to Pam's question.
I think it's a very important question, and I would answer it as I did in my opening remarks. First of all, I don't make what I feel is sometimes made a divide between the struggle for democracy and the achievement of socialism. In other words, inherent in the civil rights movement was the struggle to democratize the state. But that was not the end of it, because as you're aware, the civil rights movement went over, a good part of it, to the struggle against war and poverty, which in that sense attacked the policies of the state. So I think we're constantly dealing with this dialectic, but we cannot say that either it's the state or it's not. It's both. And how that is done depends upon objective conditions as to the education of the working class. What we are concerned with is the ideological and political education of the working class, where such questions that are raised here are not just the property of us or we, the left, but of the entire people. How will these problems of society be resolved? And ultimately, in a democratic process led by a left, the question of what type of state and what type of society we will have will be determined by the people. People want to talk about Stalinism or top-down. Let's be real. The Communist Party in the 1930s through the 60s and 70s participated in every bottom-up movement. The communists went into the trade union movement not to tell workers what to do, but to help and be a part of organizing the working class. It was the same thing in the civil rights movement. And that's why I say, hey, look, let us find answers to these problems, not merely through theories, but through actual experiences. And our people have a rich history that we can draw upon. And forgive me for saying this, the experience of SDS is not equivalent to the experience of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Civil Rights Movement. And I ask the question, why is it so difficult? Forgive me for my voice raising like that. Why is it so difficult for us to see that experience of millions of people marching, of organizers at the grassroots? We call it the Black Freedom Movement. Why can't we learn from it and the ways that it went about solving problems and apply what is applicable from that time to this? That's my methodology. Forgive me for talking too much.
Thank you for those really exciting contributions. I'm coming from England. So I've slightly different experience of the pandemic, maybe. I was very glad to work for the state as part of the vaccination program, which seemed to me like a really fabulous contribution to public health. It was paid for by the government that did lots of things wrong, but I think that was right, and it was good and a valuable contribution. And it was a real eye-opener of social mobilization. People were really happy to get involved in it and to do it. Some people did it voluntarily. Some people did it. I was paid. I was glad to be paid because I'd lost my job. I think it's not all good news about what governments did about the pandemic, but here I have a slightly different perception. Both my daughters were off school for a year. The older one's college was closed. Tens of thousands of young people were fined for being out and about in parks and on the street, because that was the policy, to police that. Political protests were beaten off the streets in London on the 5th of November 2021 because of the COVID policy. we will have no public manifestation whatsoever. We had, and this is true I think also in the US, that the people who lost jobs, who were a significant number of people, were principally younger people and much more women than men. It really was a economic policy that was destructive of people's livelihoods, and I think this is something that people aren't really taking on board. That I don't know what's happening in the US, but I can tell you that in Britain, out of it, we're getting a much tougher police bill because of the government decided that it needs yet more powers to suppress people, which all of us are opposed to, left people principally, but lots of people are against these police powers. And furthermore, and I think this is the thing that I'm listening to you and I'm not hearing, is that it demobilized the left more than anything. We had a robust, it faced a lot of problems, but we had a robust left-wing culture in Britain just before the pandemic. It was destroyed by the end of the pandemic because the possibilities of social organization when you are under a curfew are significantly restricted. And also politically, when you hand your authority to policing your society over to the government and you say to them, we trust you, you will look after us, you can close our schools and our factories, you can send us home, you can put your police to make us stay indoors, you lose all your authority. So I want to learn a lesson from the Black Freedom Movement. I think the lesson that I would like to learn most would be, we are not afraid.
Well, that's true.
We are not afraid. And I think the trouble is that driven by fear, we lost our authority and gave it to people who did not have our best interests at heart.
I would like to start with just a brief quote by Engels in responding, James. When one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another such that death results, we call the deed manslaughter. When the assailant knew in advance that the injury would be fatal, we call his deed murder. But when society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position that they inevitably meet it too early and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by the sword or bullet, the offense is more one of omission than of commission. But murder it remains. Right? I mean, I just find it... I just find it absolutely incredible, right? Like, 1 million people are dead in the United States. The hallmark, right, of socialism as a tradition, which comes from republicanism before it, right, is that it doesn't narrowly fixate, right, on negative freedom, that we have a positive conception, right, of freedom, right? And that means that there are times, right, in which we're going to need to intervene collectively, right, be it through the state or another institution, to protect people. And, I mean, I just feel like there are a lot of errors in your discourse. I mean, you're talking like, you say, well, people weren't getting paid for their jobs. I mean, who here is sitting here and saying that, we shouldn't be giving working people more money than we did? I mean, nobody's saying that. We're advocating for a stronger health response, right? That's what we're saying. I mean, when you say, there was a new police bill passed and they've increased the power of police, who here is saying, that we should be increasing the power of police because of COVID? Right? And this is why I talked about China with respect to the economic policy as well. And I'm not saying that China's perfect, by the way, of course. But, in general, I just feel like, and it's really been weird to me in this panel, because, when people talk about COVID, by the way, if the left was demobilized during COVID, it was because it didn't have a coherent response to COVID, which should have been a no-COVID policy, right? But, I mean, I've seen this at this conference, too, where people will speak about liberalism in this totally derisive way. Liberals are doing this, liberals are doing that. Right? And then we start to talk about COVID and they're like, but individual freedoms, right? Bodily autonomy, right? And it's like, where'd your socialism go? Where is the collectivism? Where's the defense of positive liberty, right? So, I mean, I'm sorry, I just can't, I can't take it seriously, so.
Yeah, thank you. When the pandemic started, I taught the last chapter, toward the end of the chapter, of Foucault's Discipline and Punishment, about, the rise of quarantine policy and the rise of the state. And my students' responses was, where's our fucking panopticon? Like, why don't we have a panopticon? What's wrong with our state? By which they meant is, why don't we have a coherent public health policy? And why do we associate public health with authoritarianism, right? So, and I think this is the point that the gentleman was making over here, that there is a big...
gentleman?
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry.
Conrad.
Conrad, thank you. Apologies. Conrad was making... Yeah, okay. I think the point that Conrad is making is that public health is a possible restriction of freedom, but it is exactly the opposite of authoritarianism, right? I mean, I'm obsessed with these articles in the New York Times. They're always like, China's COVID policy, but at what cost, right? And I'm like, well, people have estimated that 3.5 million people would have died had there not been a zero COVID policy. So maybe that's the cost, right? So 3.5 million people didn't die. So same thing with Cuba. At what cost do they have a COVID policy? Well, 1 million people didn't die, right? So I would really, I'm not saying that COVID lockdown policies are often done competently, correctly. They're often done cynically. Obviously, the notion of arresting students or kids at a park, which is probably the safest place to be during a pandemic, is obviously absurd. But if you look at what states did that were very successful, they had testing and tracing programs, building ventilation programs, paying people to stay at home. These are actually entirely consistent and coincident with the demands of socialism, right? So, the people over profits, right? And what undermined COVID policy in the US was that people were very comfortable to kill other human beings for profit, which is the ultimate problem of capitalism, right? That is what capitalism has decided is good for us, right? So what is good for capital is good for people, and if people dying is good for capital, it's okay, right? And I think that's the politics that we need to have, and I get obviously rather heated to suggest somehow that a responsible COVID policy, or responsible public health, is the opposite of socialism. I would very strongly disagree with that statement.
All right, so two things. First, I strongly push back against something that both the gentleman on the left and Benjamin mentioned, which is the myth that China had a better COVID response that saved more lives. It is a patently false claim if you start looking at other aspects of public health, because all medical resources have been so focused on COVID that people cannot get treatment for cancer, for heart attack. There's even been a lot of cases where in cities like Xi'an last year and Shanghai right now, a lot of childbirth has to happen at home. And there's been a lot of death that comes from infant mortality, something that's almost unheard of, in a semi-developed or developed country. In Xi'an last year, there's been starvations and famine because food supply was cut off to cut down the amount of contact people have. And it's one thing to talk about how effective a response is. Another thing to talk, an easier criteria to meet to just save more lives in terms of numbers, right? And even in terms of that, I don't think China's actually saved more lives. If you really focus on how many other lives are lost through services being cut off and society stop functioning due to COVID policies, right? And let alone, this is not to mention things that cannot be quantified, right? Suicide rates in places like Beijing and Shanghai has gone up given how many jobs were destroyed, how many small businesses has gone bankrupt. And also, we spent a lot of time critiquing the US on how little has been given to the working class, right? China has not handed out a single stimulus check, neither to people who are, neither to the proletariat nor to even the petty bourgeois, right? So, so I do not think that, I know this might risk sounding like a liberal, but it's one of the few times when I would actually agree with the New York Times that there's a huge human cost to such policies. And if you do not live in China, or if you don't have relatives living in China, you won't have a good sense of what this kind of human cost really is. So I would ask you to not make such claims from a detached and, sorry for the word, privileged perspective, where you don't have to suffer the consequences of such policies. All right. Okay. Another thing, the second thing, more directly to the gentleman on the left. I would want to ask about what do you mean by the nationalization of a company? Because if you mean something like a publicly owned company that serves a public interest and is held accountable to the public as a general stakeholder model, that is definitely not the case with Chinese state-owned enterprises. Because at the end of the day, those are privately owned by the most higher ups of the party. For something to be naturalized in China means for the wealth to be added to the pool of corruptible wealth for those in power. In many ways, China has two castes. The first caste of those in the party, and the second caste of everyone who's not in the party. And nominal wealth of how much you have is only nominal, determining whether you're actually in the first class or how much connections you have in the first class. So I'm really curious about what your definition of a nationalized enterprise really is, and in what shape or form does it actually benefit the proletariat? Because in China, it certainly doesn't. All right, thank you.
I would just say in response very quickly, actually how many people die is a knowable number, right? Like there's an actual quantifiable number of excess done by epidemiologists regarding excess mortality. So one can
actually... If we don't count that number, we won't know it, and that's exactly what's happened. It's impossible to do good investigative journalism in China for very apparent reasons.
I'm sorry, what? I didn't hear you. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
He said that they don't count the numbers, and it's impossible to do investigative journalism in China, so that these infant mortality rates and other things remain uncounted in the death toll.
What the World Health Organization told us.
Well, I think the other point one could make, I would be very surprised if the infant mortality rate in China would equal 3.5 million dead, which was the estimate of how many people would have died without China's policy. But I also think China on some level is to some degree kind of a straw man, because there have been many non-authoritarian states that have also had functional zero COVID policies that have done so without authoritarian methods, and have done things like contact tracing, paying people to stay at home, testing policies, and rebuilding ventilation systems, right? And those are actually just public health measures that have very little to do with the kind of authoritarian policies that we're discussing. And so I think the question is, what do the states that have prevented COVID have in common? They have robust public health programs. Some of them are authoritarian, some of them are not. Some of them are run by competent people, some of them are run by petty little dictators. But the question is, they have things in common, which are the markers of public health, right? So one has to ask, well, why don't we have a comprehensive public health program in this country, right? So why are we okay with this level of death? And I think that's a serious question. And to say, well, one state happens to be authoritarian, had a zero COVID policy, I don't think is somehow an excuse for allowing 1 million people to die.
Real quick, just to kind of try and bring some of the other panelists in, Conrad, before you speak, and I'm going to let you speak, is I do want us to revisit in some ways in the context of this comment, the panel description, right? How has the neoliberal antinomy of progressive liberalism and personal responsibility been in some ways rehashed, or kind of there's been a recrudescence of it in the COVID crisis? And what does it mean about capitalism that the response to the COVID crisis seems to be a demand for kind of at best a progressive liberal state intervention, or in some other cases things that are some might consider more clearly authoritarian, or on the other hand complete personal responsibility for something that really isn't individuals' fault, that the masses of people on earth are being blamed for getting a disease that they didn't create, and that has really nothing to do with how they've been living their lives, but is killing them, and that they are in some respect being blamed for their inability to follow whatever directives are coming from the state. And so I wonder if this question of progressive liberalism could be addressed also by CAM, if Cam could address some of the discussion that's been going on, and Professor Monteiro. But Conrad, I'm going to let you respond because I know that a lot of this was directed at you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I find it a little bit strange to say that these things aren't known, and therefore imply that, because they're not known, there must be such a huge human rights catastrophe that all of us are wrong. I mean, it seems like, if that's the case, then, we're in a territory in which, we simply can't make arguments. But I certainly do think that as far as any discernible, serious statistical data goes, I mean, I just think saying a bunch of people have committed, killed themselves or something, and that's the same thing. I mean, I think it's crazy, really. It doesn't make sense. As for your second point, I mean, I did point out that, in spite of there being a lot of public capital in China, I think that, particularly, in terms of the failure of Tiananmen Square, which, had maybe its most publicly visible leaders were kind of liberal and dubious, but at some point it was a mass movement. I think it has been the case that the absence of democracy has led there to not having been a sufficient investment in certain social services. But I do actually think that we shouldn't move too fast, though, because we really have to go issue by issue in terms of discussing that. I mean, the support that's been given by the public sector for housing development, right, has led to a situation where you have 90% home ownership in China, unlike, I think, 64 or 67 in the United States. China, while, the medical system is still kind of piecemeal, purportedly the government is trying to progress toward creating a truly universal and accessible medical care system, which is very expensive, right? Remind you, we're talking about a much poorer economy. While this is still sort of scattershot, it is notable to point out that partly because of public support that's been given, in China right now they have twice as many hospital beds per capita as in Canada, right? And about 1/4 of the GDP per capita, which is almost shocking, right, as a statistic. And also, of course, we've seen huge developments with things like transport infrastructure. I mean, 25 million miles of high-speed rail that have been laid down, right, in about the last 10 years or so. So this is incredible. And I mean, even, Samir Amin was sort of, while not wanting to overstate, how much these things have benefited the Chinese working class. And it's funny, when you say working class, because actually, while there's been a lot of enrichment in China, you could argue that proportionally, the working class, because of the need to repress the value of labor, right, in order to encourage foreign investment in China, that it's actually been the working class who proportionally benefited the least, right? So, for example, you could talk about perhaps people in the rural countryside as having benefited more, right, than the working class in relative terms, right? And that has to do with the shattering of the iron rice bowl in the 90s and all of this stuff. But I mean, I think that Samir Amin was, while not wanting to overstate, the significance of social programming or welfarism in China, he did point out that, when you look at China and you look at India, it's absolutely incomparable to discuss, proletarian people living in, large housing blocks in which all their basic needs are met, versus the working class living, in a total sort of state of abjection and, slums replete with poverty and all of this. So I do think that difference is important to acknowledge, and it's important to acknowledge what China's done. I would also add that I think that, while it's important to bring up the points about welfarism, we also shouldn't be totally consumed by the question of welfarism, because I think sometimes in the West it's our tendency to try to think of a left-wing program in terms of redistribution of wealth, right? The capitalists make the money, the government comes in, they kind of redistribute it, those things benefit, the people in general. And I think one thing that's very, very promising in China is it's not the case that, you have just, private capital that's then being taxed and money's being put into social programs. What you actually have is you have the economy being owned, right, by the state itself, right? The largest industry is being owned directly by the state itself. Now, again, perhaps we could say that that isn't completely adequate, and there's more work to be done, surely. Though I note that in China, populism, right, has almost entirely taken on a left-wing form, which is partly because they don't tolerate right-wing expression in China. I mean, if you drape yourself in the image of Mao, that's about the only way to have a viable populist movement, right? But I think that what's clear is that in the West, the model of which was often adopted of having private capital and then just taxing it, that didn't work, right? It created some very, very interesting contradictions, contributed to the formation of a lot of movements, but it ultimately was not successful. So I think that we really, really have to, and also just acknowledging that as well in China, while we might not say, maybe we're going to say, well, the government's a government of advanced workers, it's not a real peasant or proletarian government, right? One thing you have to say is that, a lot of the big capitalists in China, they really dislike the government, right? And a lot of that is because, if you look at, the way they're funneling money into infrastructure projects, things like Belt and Road, this is not a government, right? It has political independence, right, from the immediate valorization of capital, right? So I think that already, portends well for the possibility of a more meaningful mass intervention into Chinese politics.
Yeah, I've got a couple. I think some of this has been a good example of the sort of authoritarianism that this moment has really enabled. And I think, if you are just given the binary of collectivism and individualism, it's not, a dialectical way of looking at it to just say collectivism. You can only exercise your personal individual rights through society. And part of democracy is the right to work, right? It's easy to talk about paying people not to work, but that's kind of a bit of an insulated position. Where I work, the inspector, the provincial inspector who makes sure things aren't gross, work from home. But everyone else, if they stopped working and if they just sat at home watching Netflix, people would stop eating, right? There's a lot of essential services that stop a very fragile society from starving to death, not having electricity, running water. And you can't just have all those people on some sort of UBI and buying things off Amazon.
All right. So I thought at first there would be some agreement on the panel because we started with Conrad and Tony, who were criticizing Bernie, which I agreed with. But I want to bring up a very stark difference I noticed between...
So we can hear you.
Okay. Is that all right? So I'm going to bring up a very stark difference I noticed between Conrad and Tony on one hand and Cam on the other over the question of policies of the state. So is the goal of socialism changing the policies of the state? Should that be something that we look to as a success? Or is that something we settle for in retrospect when the original goal fails? So specifically to Conrad, Anthony, and Benjamin Balthaser, if the state today is fascist, then why wasn't the New Deal fascist? Or why wasn't it, the New Deal as the other side of Jim Crow? If the state is fascist, then does that mean that all the progressive movements for the last 50 or 60 years have only helped stabilize and save the capitalist state? Because if all we want is better treatment from the capitalist state, then why are we Marxists or socialists? Why not just progressive liberals?
Quickly. Just quickly, and then I'll pass it over to the people who the question was asked of. The Communist Party in the United States did consider Roosevelt a fascist until the Popular Front came.
No, they didn't.
Yeah, you can find these actual...
You can find... Well, go ahead.
Okay, so maybe not the Communist Party as a whole organization, but his leadership did describe him as a latent American fascist.
Go
ahead. That's a really interesting question. I was just reading Angela Davis's autobiography a couple weeks ago, and she talked a lot about the Black Panther Party Congress Against Fascism. I think it was 1969 or 1970. And of course, if anybody bore the brunt of the authoritarian American state, it would be the Black Panther Party. I mean, its leaders were assassinated, they were arrested in mass arrests, and the movement was, literally crushed by bullets in many cases. And Angela Davis said, well, I really appreciated this conference against fascism because it allowed all these sort of parts of the left to cohere. So SDS was part of the conference, the old Communist Party was part of the conference, Herbert Aptheker was one of the speakers at the conference. And so the sort of anti-fascist discourse allowed a lot of the sort of segments of the left to get together, and sort of talk about the state and the state repression that they were all experiencing and the sort of lack of democracy. But she said, on the other hand, I didn't actually agree that we're in a complete fascist moment. I mean, here we are at this conference, right? Talking about the state being fascist. We can still organize and hold elections, right? You can go vote for your municipal representative. And so I think the theory of fascism that I subscribe to is Herbert Marcuse's theory that the state is kind of preemptively counter-revolutionary, right? Or it's sort of selectively fascist. That America has a lot of the characteristics of a fascist state, a mass incarceration system, a brutal repression of protest, a lack of concern over incredibly unequal health outcomes, a lot of acceptance of casual daily violence, but it is not a fascist state in the sort of totalizing sense that one might think of as Nazi Germany or Pinochet's Chile, etc. And I think one needs to live in that contradiction, that on one hand, yes, we have the freedoms to do things. We can, labor unions are still legal. They're not necessarily easy to form, but they are still legal. And in most fascist states, labor unions are banned, right? You can still actually vote for socialist candidates, right? In most fascist states, socialist candidates are banned. However, we also live in a state that has an incredible repressive apparatus, and both things can be true simultaneously, and so one has to organize in that contradiction, right? In some moments and in some populations, you're going to have to think about the fact that you're going to face violence from vigilantes, right? So civil rights workers in the 1960s and 1950s did go armed, even ones that profess quote-unquote nonviolence, right? Because they understood they're going to face fascist violence in the South. At the same time, in other places, people were trying to elect pro-civil rights candidates, right? And so that contradiction was part of that movement as well. And I think we're living in that contradictory state, which is an odd place to be, but nonetheless the place we are.
Yeah, sure. So I'm just like trying to understand your question. Your question is like, so I never, by the way, I just want to say, I never said that the current state is fascist. But just with respect to your question was, if today we say the state is fascist, don't we have to say that the state of the New Deal was fascist? I think that was sort of your angle.
That was part of it. The other part of his question was about, do socialists fight for transformations in the policy of the state? Or is that only something that we, socialists kind of retroactively after the fact say was the goal when they don't get the real goal, which is maybe revolution? I don't know, to borrow a phrase from Lenin, smashing the state.
Sure, yeah. I think on one hand, so again, I didn't describe the current state of things as fascist, and I'm not, I think that these questions can be interesting to explore. I think when it becomes kind of ubiquitous to say those things, like, oh, well, the current state is fascist, I'm not sure it always adds much to our discussion, because that, for that to mean something would presuppose that we actually understand what fascism is, and that's actually a really, really complex debate in the history of Marxism. But I will say that if we were to try to argue that in some sense or another, the current state is more fascist than the state than the state of the New Deal, or more malevolent in any case. I think what that really has to do is it has to do with its class composition, right? So in other words, in that period, yes, working people were fighting, right? They were seeking enhancement of labor rights, enhancement of social programming and so forth. And at the risk of simplifying, these things were achieved. We didn't get to the communism of the 23rd century, and that's unfortunate. But I think that in these struggles, right, manifesting, in the operations of the state, it led to there being the state functioning in a different way than it did previously, right? And I think the result of that was that you had a state that was somewhat more plural, right, and somewhat more conscious of the interests of different segments of the society. In this respect, I consider it an absolutely uncoincidental, right? That you've had this combination of neoliberalism and authoritarianism that we've seen, right? That we can really trace also upward from Reagan, right? Because I think that when you're pursuing policies which are radically anti-labor, when you're disempowering large segments of the population, right? I think that that's a sort of economic environment in which political authoritarianism can be made to flourish, right? So I do think that we have to make a difference there. But as for, you were paraphrasing the question, but as for this issue about, are the social welfarist gains just, the sort of consolation prize, and the left says, oh, well, we're not so bad because we earn these things? I mean, I always just find this like such a strange way of talking about, like, because it's like, if a lot of you guys are here, right, able to like be in an institution where you have the freedom to like read books and participate in this kind of discourse, it's because of those gains that were made. And that's exactly what I said the other day. My great-grandfather was a lumberjack, his son was a professor, right? So to talk about this, like, this is, is it communism in the future? No, it may not be, but we shouldn't let the perfect, we can keep the perfect in mind. I want to keep the perfect, but we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? And that good happens to be the foundation of middle-class society in North America, the reason perhaps most of you are here today, right? The reason that we're able to live, if not at perhaps the standard we would like, with, certainly a higher, decidedly higher level of dignity than we saw within, the extremities of 19th century capitalist society. And that remains the case today, even if the overall economic arc of society at this time is towards, tragically, a sort of restoration of 19th century conditions. But hey, that's what we have to avert, right? But anyway, this is my point. I'm saying I really don't think that you can trivialize these things as a consolation prize. What I think is that we have to go out there and fight for communism, but and we, if we fall short of that, we can acknowledge it. But the goal should also be to affect good things on the way to creating that, right? And we shouldn't trivialize, right? The dramatic changes, dramatic positive changes, which are achieved en route to accomplishing that objective.
Go ahead, more questions.
Okay, we're drawing to the end of the time. I'm going to take 2 more questions. I know everybody in the world had questions. Well, 3. I'll take 3. I'll take Rebecca, Danny, and Lucas. And I'm very sorry for everybody, but we just don't have the time. And I'm going to take them all at once, and then we're going to turn it to the panelists, and you guys can give your kind of final remarks. And, we'll try and keep you to it, though. Make sure you answer all the questions. So let's go, Lucas.
Hello. So the question of fascism was kind of raised right now. So I'm going to tell a little anecdote about German social democracy. Yesterday, Parker McQueenie, I think, was it, from Cosmonaut, he talked about how the SPD, under the German Empire, their principle was no money to the system, to this government, no budget. So they even opposed these great Bismarckian reforms, healthcare and sick, care and so on and so forth. And also a comrade of mine, a few days back, told the story how the 1874, the Social Democrats in the Reichstag, they opposed forced vaccination of smallpox because that was a question of principle. Who does it? It's not what is being done. So later, in the 1970s, so we're not in the 1870s anymore, in the 1970s, some things have changed. For example, German social democracy in a federal election publishes this TV commercial, The slogan of the conservatives in that time, the opponents of the social democrats, was Freiheit statt Sozialismus, freedom instead of socialism. And the Social Democrats took that up in the TV commercial. And they said, look, what do we stand for? We stand for various welfare measures. They, of course, did it a bit, more longer than I can. And they said, look, this great man of German history, Bismarck, had the same program. So the question would be, what happened in these 100 years with German social democracy that in the 1870s until 1914, they were opposed against the regime that Bismarck built, the Iron Chancellor, And later, they are proud to be in the heritage of Bismarck. So in the end, the question of welfare status would be, when were we closer to the achievement of socialism? In the 1970s with Bismarckian National Social Democracy, or in 1918, where we didn't have this nice little welfare state, but a German working class who was willing to die to fight for socialism, willing to die to fight to unite with Soviet Russia. So that is the question that I would pose. Are we closer to socialism right now with a working class in Germany who are basically just abject zombies waiting for government handouts, or with a working class who's willing to die on the barricades?
Damn. So like, I just so I had a kind of question about the ambivalence regarding Biden's COVID policies, which is that in the kind of summer and fall of 2019, there was kind of the expectation, I think, that kind of Donald Trump was probably going to win again. This is why the Democratic Party had, I think, as Conrad said, you know, 1 million centrists blooming or 1,000 centrists blooming at that time. Then COVID hit the US in 2020, and then the entire campaign was about removing Trump, basically, on that he has blood on his hands and that he's responsible for millions of people dying. Now we've had a year of Biden, and I kind of am curious, like, did the left kind of get what it wanted in November 2020 because it removed Donald Trump? In other words, it kind of removed him with the idea that it was going to, I don't know, improve outcomes in terms of the pandemic or something, that he really was kind of the cause of everything at least happening in the United States. So that was my first question. And then my second statement, I think there was a little bit of, I don't know, maybe right Hegelianism or kind of allergy to the word failure that was happening on this panel. Meaning I think people hear failure and they hear dismissal, or you're hitting somebody on the head. But like was just said way better than me, that was kind of the point I was gonna make. When we talk about failure, we're talking about moments of missed potential, and one of the ways in which that potential might be covered up is turning the defeat into the victory. So it's not about putting it like an F on, you know, someone's homework, but saying, how can we take responsibility for the way in which we potentially cover up potential in the present by saying, yes, you know, we want the pathos of people struggled. I'm not trying to dismiss all these people that struggled, but I'm rather trying to say, how did they miss the opportunities that they aimed for? And if we simply call that a gain and a victory, we can be covering that up. And so that's my point.
Is this on? Oh, hi, everyone. I want to just build a bit on Danny's question. You know, this question of learning from failures. And again, kind of failures it does tie into kind of the horizons of what we want from transformative politics.
Just speak a little
louder. I apologize, sorry. So I said our failures, maybe just as a caveat, and just to keep in mind, are defined by the horizons of our politics. And when we say, with transformative politics, I would despair if we would cap it at a welfare state, if it is not the dictatorship of the proletariat. Having worked in a welfare state, I was working in homelessness for the British state, which is probably one of the bigger ones in the world. And it is really depressing seeing how people's kind of like basic standards of life can be kind of rewritten by will of the capitalist government. Sorry, as an aside. So to build on Danny's question, I want to look back at Bernie Sanders. And I want to ask you, maybe was it a failure that the left supported Bernie Sanders again in the 2020 primaries? Why didn't we learn from 2016? And what were the horizons of Bernie's politics between 2016 to 2020 that people seemed to want to support again, right? Because it's easy from the standpoint to say we never should have supported Bernie. Of course, he was going to support Biden. But actually, in the moment, and I remember listening to one of Jacobin's podcasts, not podcasts, I think it was like one of their, convention events, and they confessed, I forgot who it was. I think it was Alex. I forget her last name. He was saying, I was always taught that the Democratic Party is the graveyard to kind of social movements, or the graveyard of progress. But we'll make an exception for Bernie. And it did. You can listen to the recording, and it's very sad to look back, at this defeat. So sorry, to summarize, how can we learn from this? How can we learn from the failure to learn between 2016 and 2020?
That last sentence, how could we learn? Could you?
From the failure to learn between 2016 and 2020, as in why did the left support Bernie the loser 2 times? My mom called him a loser too, by the way. My mom was like this, working lady in Texas. She's like, Aaron, Bernie Sanders is a loser. Anyway.
That's the worst thing you can be in American public life, right?
It really is, unfortunately. I don't know who wants to go first, but this is going to be final remarks. And I only said that because Tony called him a loser too, so I'm not trying to, bash on Bernie. But could this also encapsulate your closing remarks, please? The questions: are we closer to socialism now when German SPD supports Bismarckian policies versus in 1918 when there wasn't really any of this stuff and socialists weren't supporting it? Danny's question about failure as a missed opportunity. And did the left get what it wanted in 2020? And then Rebecca's question about learning between 2016 and 2020. Why did the left go for Bernie twice?
Do you trust me on this?
No. All right, please go ahead. Thank you.
Why don't we start down there and go to
Yes. I don't think I'll be able to address all of that in a short closing remark. But what I think is important that has been raised by these questions, and just generally the discussion we've had, is the problems posed by an affirmative view of history. And the idea that we've made substantial progress without qualifying what kind of progress you're talking about. Conrad, for example, I don't think that it was impossible 100 years ago that 100 people could get together in a room and talk about socialism. They did that a lot. It's not something that was given to us by the state.
That's what I said, by the way, that it was impossible 100 years ago for people to get in a room and talk about socialism.
No, I'm saying it was possible to do that.
Yeah, I'm saying, of course, this is a straw man. That's all I mean.
Right. But you're saying, look what's been given to us. Your great-grandfather was a lumberjack, and he had a professor for a son.
I was acknowledging what is, a clear fact, which is that rates of education have greatly increased. But I was acknowledging what is actually, in fact, a clear fact, which is that rates of public education have greatly increased since that time. And I just don't see the utility of saying, in the past, people had their own things. Before there was, a state intervention that was explicitly advocated for, by the working class en masse. I don't see the purpose of that,
I think this gets to the fundamental disagreement between us, because I do think the question of who is doing it is what matters. In terms of the struggle for socialism, who is affecting the change?
Yeah, and you don't see the actual balance of class forces that contributed to those changes, right? Everything is presented as a vertigo of conspiracy, right? It's the state, it's just, the elites, and therefore it doesn't matter, right? And that's the problem, right? You really have to have a more nuanced analysis than that.
I don't think about public policy as a conspiracy against the poor. That's not anything that I've said. The state is responding to democratic discontents and the problem of society. It addresses it in what I was talking about with Roosevelt of offering everything to everyone and picking and choosing and playing the role of the mediator. But that is not some sort of Illuminati theory. I think that's a decent description of how government works in the 20th and 21st century.
Benjamin, do you want to give kind of closing remarks?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, the gentleman, I'm not a German historian, but the gentleman's response in the back about the SPD, it's sort of funny. I would say in some ways, and maybe this is my, I don't know, maybe radical Gramscianism or something, but like both SPDs on some level were right and wrong at the same time. Like, you know, so the SPD also backed World War I, right? Isn't that correct? And backed the government during World War I. And then also, of course, the SPD ended up collaborating in the execution of, you know, prominent members of the Communist Party. So I completely understand what you're saying. Yes, there's these different approaches to the state. There's different approaches to historical conjunctures. There's different approaches to organizing the working class. And that is the complication of the task ahead of us, right? Because what is radical in one conjuncture is going to be reactionary in another. What is a demand that will organize the working class as a constituency that can advocate for its own desires is going to be different in a different moment, right? So in the 1960s, it seemed very obvious that students would be the revolutionary vanguard. Is that obvious now in the neoliberal university? I'm not sure, right? So, I mean, possibly, I'm not against it. But the notion that every historical moment on some level produces different historical subjects and different tasks and goals and objects for its struggle, I think is the real difficulty in understanding what is the radical thing to do. I think in some ways it was the right thing to organize for Bernie Sanders in 2016. I think it would be the wrong thing to do it in 2024, right? Because the historical conditions have changed. There seemed to be an opening for kind of social democratic politics that would...
Yeah, what about 2020? My question was 2020, not 2024.
2020. Oh. I don't know. I mean, like, I think it was fine. I think the lesson is like, that didn't work. Let's not do it again. You know, but I don't actually see that the left is in some state of catastrophe and disarray because it supported Bernie Sanders in 2020, and the DSA was very clear that we do not support Biden, right? This notion that somehow supporting Bernie Sanders led to a support of Biden, the DSA, et cetera, has been very clear that we did not endorse Biden, and actually got a lot of crap for that. So I think that it was clear that yes, this is a moment of, you know, what Gramsci would call a kind of class realignment. There seemed to be a kind of detachment between constituencies and their leaders in a particular moment. Perhaps there's an opening here in electoral politics. We'll try it out, right? There's a kind of romantic... I actually believe, you know, as one organizer told me, I used to work as a labor organizer, you actually have to be a romantic optimist to be a socialist. You have to just try things out, right? If there's an opening, you have to try to push it. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but the question is always the same. Does this help organizing the working class? There seemed to be a possibility that having someone speaking for socialism and speaking for the working class with a national platform could possibly help a working class movement that is in the dumps right now. And actually, I think you can see in a lot of organizing campaigns that people actually at the grassroots were inspired by someone talking about the working class and socialism to do a different kind of working class politics. So again, you can accuse me of a lot of things, but one thing I am is a romantic optimist. That's something I learned as an organizer. You really have to look for openings and exploit them if you possibly can, knowing that oftentimes they're not going to work. So I think the lesson that I learned from Bernie Sanders was, yeah, it was a good thing to try in that moment. The moment now has changed. The liberal bourgeoisie has actually become, I think, more reactionary even since then, and as a response to Bernie Sanders. So I think that attempt wouldn't work again, right? But it was something to try, and I think actually had some positive results. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I like to. I agree with the last thing Benjamin said. And I'd like to connect that to Rebecca's question, what have we learned? Or even a better question, how do we learn? Because somehow the question of how we learn will have a big determination about what we learn and what is the framework, the frameworks that we think through. What are our historical references for making a judgment about a Sanders campaign, 2016, 2020, and I hope not in 2024, but you know, let's see. I think this question of is the working class more ready for socialism now than it was 50 years ago I don't think we can answer that question right now. I think it's a great question, but it's one that we cannot answer. But I think it is a great question to ask. With that, all.
You know, I really just wanted, because I feel like there was a common thread that ran through the questions. And, you know, that common thread was essentially, you know, if we see in a positive light the achievements that have been accomplished by socialist movements, for example, absent the realization of communism, isn't there a risk that we lose sight of achieving that final objective, right? And so I'd like to just intervene very briefly into that question. And I think, you know, obviously the real issue here, you know, is finding a position which acknowledges, you know, both the possibility of transforming reality, you know, raising people out of poverty, providing education, right, remaking our world, as well as acknowledges the need to keep the goal in view, right, of creating communism. And I think you can see the obvious, you know, everybody here has, you know, for the most part, most of the people who are asking questions, their angle was that, you know, if we see positively the things that are accomplished along the way, you know, when communism isn't created, that this will just lead to a kind of class compromise, right? And that's true, right? Like if we, okay, okay,
Let him speak.
so that's true, right? That if we make it all about, you know, these kind of incremental reforms and we just lose sight of trying to achieve, yeah, okay, that's absolutely a problem. But what happens if we go the other way, right? What happens if we lose sight of all the things that have been accomplished along the way, right? And I think what very, very clearly happened, like if we just say like, well, you know, the real thing we have to do is to abolish the value form, right? And if we're not going to abolish the value form, there's no point in engaging. It's like, you know, Marx said that's 10,000 years old in some form or another, right? So if you make that like the sine qua non of like a functional politics, that's only going to lead to fatalism and disengagement, right? So again, you know, what I said is I think what we absolutely need here, you know, is a dialectical approach toward that question that doesn't tilt toward, okay, all we need are incremental reforms, or on the other hand, right, you know, it's, as I said, the communism of the 26th century or nothing. That's not a productive stance, okay? That's what I had to say.